Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting these colorful bubbles. This is so simple and repetitive in terms of the steps, which makes it the perfect painting subject to relax to. Let's begin by sketching out the bubbles so I can show you how I'm going to map out the negative space of the highlights. For the bubbles itself, I'm just going to draw a circle. Of course, you can play around with the size and vary the placement. In terms of the highlights, I like to leave out negative spaces which follows the curvature of the circle placed around the outer area within the bubbles. This is something that I'm going to leave out as negative space, but towards the end, I'm going to also add thinner highlights using bleed-proof white closer to the outline, as well as some opaque white dots for extra light spots. I like to also play around with the thickness of these negative spaces and with the placement, so some can be closer to the center while some are closer to the outline. I'm going to draw another one here, and this time I'm going to overlap two bubbles and apply the same type of highlights for both of those bubbles since they're going to be transparent. I'm personally going to paint the highlights freehand later on, and if you want to do the same, I would recommend for you to draw these bubbles as many times as you need in order to just get used to those negative space for extra exercise or warm up if you want. Or if you feel a bit uncomfortable painting freehand, you can also include the highlights in the sketch. I personally didn't want to do this because the colors around that area of the highlights will be very light and I don't want the pencil marks to show through, but just paint according to whatever you're comfortable with. At the bottom here, I'm going to draw a different type of bubble. This one is going to be attached to the first bubble. And this time I'm not going to paint it as transparent since sometimes a few bubbles can get stuck together. This is something that I want to include in my final painting because I want the bubbles to vary. But if you don't, this again just depends on your comfort zone with painting, but I personally want to include different types so you guys will have the choice to customize and make changes for your own paintings. I'm also going to play with the size of the bubble, so here I'm just drawing an example of a small bubble, and because of the smaller area, you'll have less space for highlights, so adjust accordingly. Lastly, I want to mention that you can also play around with how you draw the highlights. It can be angled like the ones that I drew out earlier, or the edges can also be rounded. This is completely up to you, and it just usually depends on the surrounding area and where the main light source is coming from, so you can be flexible with the shapes. So next I'm just going to sketch and plan out the composition so everything can be nice and balanced. I begin by painting the main bubbles in the middle. I'm going to make it overlay each other as well as draw the bubble that's attached together, and I also want to make these bubbles fairly large. After that, I want to add the bubbles around the corners and add medium-sized ones to fill in the space in between. For the bubbles along the edges or the corners, you can also play with the sizes and overlaps to make it look more like a natural placement, but I just personally want the corners to be filled, so I'm making larger ones. Once I finish drawing the main, medium-sized, and large bubbles, then I'm going to fill in the rest of the composition and the awkward spaces with the smaller bubbles. This is something that you can also add along the way if you feel you need to add more after you've painted everything. You can see that I've just drawn out circles for these, but as I mentioned earlier, if you feel like painting the details freehand is a bit hard, you can also sketch out the outline. Next, here are the colors I'll be using. This is Hansa Yellow Light by Daniel Smith, Cadmium Orange by Winsor & Newton, Quin Red by Daniel Smith, Cobalt Green by Holbein, Cerulean Blue by Holbein, Ultramarine Finest by Schmincke, Rose of Ultramarine by Daniel Smith, and also Bleed-Proof White by Dr. P.H. Martens. So let's begin to paint, and the first thing I'm going to do is to line the circle using different colors. And I'm using a thick consistency paint in a medium to thick brush load because I want the colors to stay mostly wet until I complete the circle. So here, as you can see, I'm just alternating the colors and I try to connect them together. As an example, the yellow to the blue, which might create a green in the middle, blue to the purple, purple to pink, or yellow to red, which means there will be orange in the middle. These are colors which are close together in the color wheel. So when we pull and sort of smudge the color together like what I'm doing now, the colors won't be muddy. Of course, there may come a time like you only have a very tiny space left and there's no way to connect the colors, like for instance the purple and the green on the right side of the bubble. And that's okay, but I try to smudge that area a little bit less so the color of the purple and the green won't blend as much. So after I painted the outline, what I did was to actually just clean and then re-dampen my brush so I can pick up the colors that's already in the outline and smudge it inwards while leaving out the negative space for the highlights. At some point, if I ran out of paint to pull and I need to add extra color in the middle, I would just take any color that I have on my palette and use a very thin consistency of it to apply to the center. For the extra color, I try to still follow the curvature or the roundness of the bubble as I apply it. This way, it will really help to create the round form. I'm just going to repeat using the same method to paint the bubble above. As you can see, you don't really have to use every single color on the palette. It's completely up to you. You can even change the whole palette completely and maybe use only blues or only reds depending on the colors that you like. Personally, I just like having different hues because I find that it gives more of an interesting reflective surface. So as an example, for the small bubble, I can only fit so much, so I just picked 3 colors, but I still followed the same method. So I'm just going to keep repeating the steps. This one, I'm painting a big one, so I'm using a lot of different colors, starting from red, orange, yellow, and with the cerulean blue, I just let it flow into the yellow to create a bit of green, and so on. As you can see, the load of my brush is a bit heavier, but I'm still using a thick consistency. This way there's more pigment for the color to spread out, but this also means that as I'm using my damp brush to smudge the colors, the flow will be faster and a little bit more uncontrollable. As I'm smudging the paint, I don't know if you noticed, but I like to do it per section. So as an example, just the red and the blue together, or just the yellow and the green together, and so on. In between those sections, I actually like to clean and re-dampen my brush with clean water. This way I don't have excess pigment from the previous colors that I've smudged mixing into the previous sections or the next sections. If this happens, that means all of the pigments will just be mixed into each other, and this will create a brown or even a blackish sort of color. So I don't want to mix it together. Instead, I want each of those sections or each of those colors to sit and mingle next to each other by using the wet surface for the paint to just travel very slowly. As you can see from the previous bubble, I started painting the ones which are going to be overlapping each other. And instead of painting the bubble which are going to be overlapped, I move on to the next bubble. This way I can wait for those bubbles to completely dry. So when I'm painting the overlapping features, those areas won't just blend into the bubble in front or at the back. For this one though, I'm going to paint the bubble attached to this one straight after because I'm not using such a heavy load on this one, and the paint will settle by the end of it, but I'll just get back to you when I'm ready to do that. I'm going to continue by painting the bubble that's attached to the previous bubble. And And I'm using basically the same method, but this time I just tried to connect the color towards the outline of that bubble. Once I'm done, just like before, I'm going to clean and dampen my brush so I can use the dampness of my brush to pick up the color or the pigments from the outline and bring it inwards. Now I'm going to go back to paint on the overlaid bubble. I'm still using the same method and I'm just painting on top of the previous one because it's completely dry, so it's much easier for me to paint on top without the colors bleeding into each other. Because the overlaid area is very small, I just smudge a little bit of the outline without painting on the highlights or leaving out that negative space. Instead, I'm just going to paint the negative space on the larger area and follow it up using bleed proof white later on. After this, I'm going to go back to the bubble that's attached together. I felt like the outline was bleeding into the wet surface, so I'm just going to re-outline it using a thicker consistency of the blue again. Next, I'm painting the overlaid bubble behind the ones attached. This time, as I'm painting the outline, I want to leave out a bit of space where the highlight of the previous bubble is, and this way it'll look a bit more translucent and it'll look like it's placed behind the first bubble. After that, I'm just going to follow it up using the same method by smudging per section and then using the rest of the pigments to paint the center. Again, if you feel like you need extra pigment for the center, you can always add on really thin consistency and also try to place it following the curvature or the roundness of the bubble. I know that the outline of this painting is very simple, but at the same time, I know that drawing circles can be kind of annoying, so I'll still have the traceable outline in my coffee shop. This will also include the highlights that I personally made in case you guys want to follow along to the exact bubbles. After this, I'm actually just going to continue to paint the rest of the bubbles, but before I leave you guys to it, I just want to mention that I had a meeting with my YouTube partner and he told me that there's a bunch of you who are not subscribed to the channel yet. I also just remembered that I got a message a while back that this person isn't getting notified of my new posts even after she's subscribed, so I guess this will be my first video that I make the call of action for you guys to please subscribe to my channel if you guys enjoy what you guys see here. And when you do, you can actually click on the arrow and find the bell icon if you'd like to get notified of my post. So yeah, I'll just leave you guys to it and I'll get back to you once I'm ready to move on to the next step. Once I'm done adding color to all the bubbles, I'm going to take out my bleed-proof white. Here I'm using a medium to thick consistency and a light brush load in order for me to be able to paint very delicate lines very close to the outline of the bubbles. I try to vary the length of the lines, and also sometimes I like to create this eye shape attached to the longer lines, and this way I find that this also adds to the roundness, even though this change is very subtle. I'm still using the same brush to paint the lines, but if your brush is a bit more frayed than mine, then you can always switch to a smaller one, so it's a little bit easier to control. When I'm painting the different lengths for the lines, you can also add tiny dots or slightly dashed lines. I like the variation, it just means that there's a lot of reflective surface. For the larger bubble here, I'm going to create a bigger eye shape. I just find that this is more in proportion compared to the smaller ones that I've been painting for the smaller bubbles. So I'm just going to continue on to paint the rest of these delicate outlines, and I'll get back to you for the next step. Sometimes after painting on the lines, if your paint is not thick enough, the white can be a little bit translucent still. So if you want to increase the opacity, sometimes I like to just layer on certain areas again. And once I'm done, the final step is for me to add extra highlights by painting on dots, this time varying in sizes and also just placing it in random areas. I try to not do too much of this because I find that too much can be a bit distracting to the painting, but adding a bit just adds this extra sparkle to the bubbles, which I like to depict for this painting. If you want and you have a really tiny brush, you can also paint on little 4-pointed stars or 6-pointed stars for extra sparkle. For me personally, I find that the scale is a bit too small for me to do this neatly, but you can always give it a go if you would like, and I'm just laying down the option in case you would like to give it a go. I'm pretty much done here, but I feel like there's awkward empty space that I need to fill up, so I'm just going to add an extra bubble. I tried to paint it on freehand. So after you're done painting everything, if you feel like you need to add more bubbles, even the ones which are overlaying each other, you can always add more on until you're happy with your composition. So that's pretty much it for this painting. I hope you guys enjoyed it. This actually turned out to be super fun and I just really enjoyed the process. Like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!